Welcome. Settle in, close your eyes, and allow your mind to drift. In the moments to come, we will embark on a long journey through history. There will be no sudden noises, no dramatic shifts in tone. My voice will remain calm, measured, and monotonous throughout, so you can fall asleep much quicker. Today, we are not going to dive into a story of grand heroes or thrilling conquests. It is, instead, a quiet exploration of a system, a vast and intricate machine of laws, logistics, engineering, and bureaucracy that we call the Roman Empire. We will examine the slow, methodical processes that allowed this civilization to rise, and the equally slow, gradual decay that led to its transformation. The purpose of this video is not to excite the mind, but to gently occupy it, to give it a complex and soothing narrative to follow as it eases its way toward sleep. We will focus on the details, the procedures, and the slow, grinding passage of centuries. There is no need to remember any of this. Simply let the information wash over you. Let the weight of history be a comforting blanket. Our journey begins, as all things must, at the very beginning, on a small collection of hills overlooking a bend in the Tiber River. The traditional narrative of Rome's origin, the one passed down by Roman historians like Livy and Virgil, is a story steeped in myth and divine intervention. It begins with the Trojan prince Aeneas, who, escaping the fall of his great city, journeyed across the Mediterranean to Italy, destined to be the progenitor of a new people. His descendants, after several generations, produced the twin brothers Romulus and Remus, born to the Vestal Virgin Rhea, Silvia, and, according to the legend, the god Mars himself. The story is well known. The infants, condemned to be drowned in the Tiber by their great uncle, were instead set adrift in a basket. They washed ashore at the foot of the Palatine Hill, where they were discovered and suckled by a she-wolf, the Lupa, in a cave that would later be known as the Lupercal. They were then found and raised by a shepherd, Faustulus, and his wife. As young men, they discovered their noble heritage, restored their grandfather to the throne of Alba Longa, and then set out to found their own city on the very hills where they had been saved. An argument over the new city's location, decided by a contest of auguryth, reading of divine will, through the flight of birds led to Romulus, killing his brother Remus. And so, on the 21st of April, 753 BC, Romulus plowed the sacred boundary, the Pomerium, and founded his city, Roma, upon the Palatine Hill. This is the story the Romans told themselves. It is a powerful foundation myth, linking their city to the gods and to the epic heroes of the past. But it is not history. It is a construction designed to give legitimacy and a sense of destiny to a people who would one day rule the known world. The archaeological reality is, as is often the case, far more mundane and, for our purposes, far more soothingly complex. The evidence unearthed on the Palatine Hill tells a different story. One not of a single founding event, but of a slow, organic process of settlement and coalescence, beginning in the 10th century BC, long before the mythical founding date. We see traces of the Iron Age Villanovan culture. Archaeologists have found post holes dug into the tufa bedrock, the faint outlines of simple wattle and daub huts, not unlike those of the shepherd Faustulus from the legend. These were small, scattered pastoral communities. They grazed their livestock on the hills and buried their dead in urns shaped like their own small huts. The pottery from this period is simple, unadorned, and functional utilitarian objects for a people concerned with subsistence, not empire. These early settlements were not a city. They were a collection of villages, each occupying one of the famed 7 hills: the Palatine, the Capitoline, the Quirinal, the Viminal, the Esquiline, the Celian, and the Aventin, the low-lying marshy ground between them, which would one day become the Roman Forum, was used primarily as a burial ground. The transition from this collection of villages into a unified city-state was a gradual process, heavily influenced by 2 more advanced neighboring cultures, the Latins, of which the Romans were a part, and more significantly, the Etruscans to the north and the Greeks in their colonies to the south. It was from the Etruscans that early Rome derived many of its most characteristic features. The Etruscan civilization, centered in modern-day Tuscany, was more urbanized and sophisticated. They were master engineers and metallurgists. It was likely under Etruscan influence and, later, direct rule, that the marshy forum was first drained and paved, transforming it from a necropolis into a public meeting space, the heart of a new city. The Etruscans brought their architectural techniques, including the use of the arch and the construction of stone temples. They also introduced their religious rites. The practice of augury, so central to the founding myth, was an Etruscan art. So too was the practice of haruspicy, the divination of the future, by inspecting the entrails of sacrificed animals. The very symbols of Roman power, the fasces, a bundle of rods with an axe, carried by lictors before a magistrate, were Etruscan in origin. This period of Etruscan dominance corresponds with the legendary era of the Roman kings, a line of 7 rulers, beginning with Romulus. Like the founding myth, the histories of these kings are a blend of fact and folklore, likely compiled much later to explain the origins of Roman institutions. Romulus was the warrior founder. His successor, Numa Pompilius, was a Sabine, credited with establishing Rome's foundational religious and legal institutions. He is said to have founded the Temple of Janus, whose gates were open in times of war and closed in peace. He established the College of Pontiffs to oversee religious law and, most famously, created the Order of the Vestal Virgins, the priestesses who tended the sacred fire of Vesta, a symbol of Rome's hearth and continuity. The historical accuracy of Numa is doubtful, but the institutions attributed to him were very real and formed the bedrock of Roman society for centuries. The next kings, Tullus, Hostilius, and Ancus Marcius, are portrayed as warlike figures who expanded Roman territory in the immediate vicinity of Latium and supposedly built the first bridge across the Tiber, the Pons Sublicius. The final 3 kings of Rome were Etruscan, their names reflecting this heritage: Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, Servius Tullius, and Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, or Tarquin the Proud. Under these kings, Rome transformed into a true city. Tarquinius Priscus is credited with establishing the Roman Games, the Ludi Romani, and beginning work on the great temple to Jupiter, Optimus Maximus, on the Capitoline Hill, as well as the Cloaca Maxima, the great sewer system that drained the Forum. His successor, Servius Tullius, is one of the most significant figures of this early period, though his historicity is also debated. He is credited with a series of crucial social and military reforms. He supposedly conducted the first Roman census, a systematic counting of the citizenry. Based on this census, he reorganized the populace into voting assemblies, the comitia centuriata, where citizens were grouped into classes based on their wealth and property. This determined both their voting power and their military obligations. It was a system designed to ensure that those with the most to lose had the greatest say in matters of state and the greatest responsibility for its defense. This Servian constitution, whether the work of one man or a gradual evolution, was a fundamental step in the development of the Roman state. The final king, Tarquin the Proud, is depicted as a tyrant whose despotic rule and the infamous actions of his son led to a popular uprising. In 509 BC, the monarchy was overthrown and the Roman Republic was born. This event, led by Lucius Junius Brutus, marked the end of kingship and the beginning of a new complex system of government that would last for nearly 500 years. The expulsion of the last king, Tarquinius Superbus, in 509 BC did not immediately result in a stable, defined republic. It initiated a long period of political evolution, driven by a deep-seated fear of the absolute power of a single individual. The new system, which developed over centuries, was not designed for efficiency, but for the prevention of tyranny. Its defining characteristics were collegiality, the principle that no office should be held by only one person, and limited terms of office, ensuring no one could accumulate power for too long. The new state was called res publica, the public thing, or the public affair, a name that itself signifies a shift from the property of a king to the collective responsibility of the citizenry. At the heart of this new structure were the magistrates, the Senate, and the popular assemblies, each with its own distinct functions, powers, and limitations, creating an intricate web of checks and balances. At the apex of the new system were the consuls. The king's singular, lifelong authority was replaced by the authority of two consuls, elected annually. They held the highest military and civil power, known as imperium, the right to command. Each consul, however, could veto the actions of the other, a powerful check that forced consensus or, at times, created paralysis. They presided over the Senate, commanded the legions in times of war, and were the chief executives of the state. Their power was immense, but it was temporary, lasting only 1 year, after which they re-entered the Senate as regular members, accountable for their actions while in office. In times of extreme emergency, the Constitution allowed for the appointment of a single dictator, who would hold supreme power for a term of no more than 6 months, a temporary and drastic measure to be used only when the state itself was in peril. Below the consuls in the hierarchy of magistrates, known as the cursus honorum, or course of offices, were the praetors. Initially, there was one praetor, but their numbers grew as Rome's territory expanded. Praetors also held imperium and could command armies, but their primary function was the administration of justice in the city of Rome. The praetor urbanus dealt with cases involving Roman citizens, while the later praetor peregrinus handled disputes involving foreigners. They were instrumental in the development of Roman law, issuing an annual edict that outlined the legal principles they would apply during their term. Over time, these edicts formed the basis of a vast and sophisticated body of jurisprudence. Further down the ladder were the aediles and the quaestors. There were 4 aediles, 2 plebeian and 2 curule. They had no imperium but held significant responsibilities for the day-to-day administration of the city of Rome. They were, in essence, public works commissioners, city managers, and market regulators. They supervised the temples, public buildings, and streets. They were responsible for the grain supply, the cura unknown, ensuring the city's populace was fed. They also organized the public games, the ludi, a costly but popular duty that could make or break a young politician's career. The quaestors were the state's financial officers. Elected annually, their numbers also grew over time. They managed the public treasury, the aerarium, located in the Temple of Saturn. They oversaw state expenditures, collected taxes and fines, and served as paymasters for the legions, accompanying generals on campaign to manage the financial logistics of war. Successful completion of a term as quaestor was the first official step into the Roman Senate. The Senate was, in many ways, the anchor of the Republic. It was not a legislative body in the modern sense. It did not pass laws. Rather, it was an advisory council, composed of around 300 of the most powerful and experienced men in Rome, former magistrates, who held their seats for life. Its pronouncements, the senatus consulta, were technically only advice to the magistrates, but they carried immense weight and were rarely ignored. The Senate controlled state finances, foreign policy, and the declaration of war. It assigned provinces to former consuls and praetors, who would govern them as proconsuls and propraetors. While it had no formal power to legislate, its influence was so pervasive that it effectively directed the long-term policy of the state, providing a crucial element of stability and continuity that the annually elected magistrates could not. Finally, there were the popular assemblies, where the Roman citizenry exercised their democratic rights. There were several, but the most important were the comitia centuriata and the comitia tributa. The comitia centuriata, a holdover from the Servian reforms, was organized by wealth into 193 centuries. It was here that the highest magistrates, consuls, praetors, and censors were elected. The voting system was heavily weighted in favor of the wealthiest classes, who voted first and comprised enough centuries to decide most elections on their own. The comitia tributa, or tribal assembly, was organized by geographical tribes. It was a more democratic body, electing the lower magistrates like quaestors and aediles, and crucially, voting on legislation proposed by magistrates. A separate and vital institution was the concilium plebis, the plebeian council, and its leaders, the tribunes of the plebs. This body emerged from the early republic's great social struggle, the conflict of the orders between the patrician aristocracy and the plebeian commoners. The 10 tribunes were elected annually by the plebeians alone. Their persons were declared sacrosanct, meaning anyone who harmed them could be killed without penalty. Their primary power was the jus intercessionis, the right to veto any act of a magistrate or any resolution of the Senate that they deemed harmful to the interests of the plebeian. This was a radical power, a check on the authority of the patrician-dominated state. Over time, the resolutions passed by the plebeian council, known as plebiscita, gained the force of law, making it a key legislative body. This entire system, collegial magistrates, a powerful advisory senate, and popular assemblies with specific powers, was a complex, often inefficient, but remarkably resilient structure. It was designed to diffuse power and force compromise, a direct reaction to the memory of absolute rule. The series of conflicts between Rome and the Phoenician city-state of Carthage, known as the Punic Wars, are often remembered for their dramatic set pieces. Hannibal crossing the Alps with elephants, the brilliant Roman victory at Zama, the total destruction of Carthage. But beneath the drama lay a century-long struggle, defined not by tactical genius alone, but by the grinding, relentless realities of logistics, economics, and resource mobilization. These wars were, at their core, a contest between two fundamentally different systems, and Rome's ultimate victory was a testament to its superior ability to absorb immense losses and sustain a prolonged war effort through the systematic organization of its resources. The conflict forced Rome, a land-based Italian power, to become a Mediterranean naval superpower, a transformation that was a logistical undertaking of staggering proportions. The First Punic War, which began in 264 BC over the island of Sicily, immediately exposed Rome's critical weakness. Carthage was a great maritime power, its wealth built on sea trade, its navy of swift quinquireme. Rome, by contrast, was a land power. Its strength was its legions, its experience confined to the Italian peninsula. It had no significant navy to speak of. To challenge Carthage for control of Sicily, let alone the seas, Rome had to build a fleet from nothing. The historian Polybius tells the story of how the Romans captured a shipwrecked Carthaginian quinquireme and used it as a blueprint. This story, while possibly simplified, illustrates the scale of the challenge. The Romans were not natural sailors. They had to learn shipbuilding and naval warfare simultaneously. The Senate ordered the construction of 100 quinquiremes and 20 triremes, a monumental task. This required the felling of vast tracts of timber from the Italian forests, the procurement of immense quantities of rope, sailcloth, and pitch, and the mobilization of thousands of craftsmen. Even more challenging was finding and training the crews. A single quinquireme required approximately 300 rowers and 120 marines for a fleet of 100. This meant recruiting and training around 30,000 oarsmen, most of whom were not sailors but land-based citizens and allies, to overcome their inexperience in complex naval maneuvers. The Romans developed a simple but effective technological solution: the corvus, or crow. This was a heavy boarding bridge, around 1.2 meters wide and 11 meters long, with a large, heavy spike on its underside. Mounted on the bow of a Roman ship, it could be raised and then dropped onto an enemy vessel. The spike would embed in the enemy's deck, locking the two ships together. This device effectively negated the superior seamanship of the Carthaginians, transforming a naval battle, a contest of ramming and maneuver, into a land battle on the sea, where the superior Roman infantry could board and overwhelm the Carthaginian crews. The corvus was a brilliant piece of practical engineering, but it was also a heavy, cumbersome device that made the ships less stable, especially in rough seas. Roman fleets were lost to storms as often as they were to the enemy, a stark reminder of the immense cost and risk of this new form of warfare. The Second Punic War shifted the logistical focus. While naval power remained crucial, the war is defined by Hannibal's audacious invasion of Italy. His march from Spain across the Pyrenees and the Alps into the heart of Roman territory is legendary. But it was, above all, a logistical nightmare. Hannibal had to feed an army of tens of thousands of soldiers, Bereans, Gauls, Numidians, and their baggage animals, including the famous elephants, through hostile or neutral territory. Foraging for food and fodder was a constant, daily necessity. Every river crossing, every mountain pass, was not just a tactical problem, but a logistical one. The attrition on his army was immense before he even faced a Roman legion. Once in Italy, Hannibal was cut off from his supply base in Spain. He had to live off the land, winning allies and capturing Roman supply depots to sustain his army for an astonishing 15 years. On the other side, Rome faced the equally daunting challenge of containing him. The war effort required the mobilization of the entire state. After the catastrophic defeat at Cannae in 216 BC, where Rome lost as many as 50,000 to 70,000 men in a single day, the Republic was pushed to its absolute limit, yet it did not collapse. This is where the logistical and demographic strength of the Roman system became apparent. Rome and its Italian allies could draw upon a vast reservoir of manpower that Carthage, which relied heavily on mercenaries, could not match. The Senate managed the crisis with methodical determination. They levied new legions, raised taxes to unprecedented levels, and managed the complex logistics of fielding multiple armies simultaneously, one to shadow Hannibal in Italy, another to fight in Spain, and yet another in Sicily. The war was fought in the quartermaster's office and the Senate house as much as it was on the battlefield. Rome's strategy under Fabius Maximus, the delayer, was a war of logistical attrition. Avoid a pitched battle with Hannibal, but harass his foraging parties and slowly wear down his army. Ultimately, Rome won not just by defeating Hannibal at Zama, but by outlasting him, by having the resources, the manpower, and the political will to sustain the conflict on multiple fronts over a decade and a half, a feat of organization that laid the administrative groundwork for its future empire. The famous saying that all roads lead to Rome is a poetic reflection of a profound logistical and engineering reality. The Roman road network was the circulatory system of the empire, the physical manifestation of its power, and its ability to project that power across vast distances. These roads were not built for comfortable travel or for the casual merchant, though they served those purposes. They were built, first and foremost, for the legions. Their primary function was military, to allow for the rapid movement of troops and supplies from one part of the empire to another, to connect newly conquered territories to the heartland, and to solidify Roman control. The construction of these roads was not an afterthought of conquest. It was an integral part of it. A legion on the march in a new province was also a legion of engineers, and as soon as a region was pacified, work on a new road would begin, a permanent line of communication and control etched into the landscape. The process of building a Roman road was a masterpiece of systematic engineering, a testament to the Roman preference for methodical, durable construction. The first step was surveying, undertaken by military engineers known as agrimensors. They were tasked with laying out the straightest and most practical route possible. The Romans famously preferred straight lines, often sighting from one high point to the next, and forging a direct path, cutting through hills, bridging rivers, and crossing marshes with causeways. This required sophisticated surveying tools. The primary instrument was the groma, a simple but effective device consisting of a vertical staff with a horizontal cross from which 4 plumb lines were suspended. By sighting along these plumb lines, surveyors could lay out perfect right angles and straight lines across the terrain. For ensuring a level or a consistent gradient, especially for drainage, they used the chorobates, a long wooden plank, about 6 meters in length, with legs at each end and a groove for water on top. If the water rested evenly in the groove, the surface was level. Plumb lines on the sides provided a less accurate measure for windier conditions. Once the path was staked out, the laborious construction process began, typically carried out by legionary soldiers. This work kept them occupied and disciplined during peacetime, and provided the empire with its most vital infrastructure. The process began by digging a trench, the fossa, down to solid bedrock, sometimes as deep as 1.5 meters. The width of the road, or via, varied. But major public roads, like the Via Appia, were typically wide enough for 2 carts to pass around, 4 to 5 meters. The excavated trench was then filled with carefully arranged layers of different materials, a technique that ensured durability and excellent drainage. The lowest layer, the foundation, was the statumen. This consisted of large, rough-hewn stones, often cemented together with mortar or clay. This layer provided a solid, stable base for the entire structure. Above the statumen came the rudis, a layer of smaller broken stones and rubble mixed with lime mortar. This layer, about 20 to 30 centimeters thick, was rammed down hard to create a dense, solid mass. It provided further stability and was a key part of the drainage system, allowing water that seeped through the top layers to filter down and away from the road's surface. The third layer was the nucleus, or kernel. This was a layer of Roman concrete, a mixture of sand, lime, and water, sometimes with crushed brick or tile mixed in. It was laid down in a thick, even layer and formed the immediate base for the paving stones. Finally, the top layer, the pavimentum or summa crusta, was laid. This was the visible road surface. On the most important highways, this consisted of large polygonal blocks of hard-wearing stone, such as basalt or flint, fitted together with meticulous precision. The surface was given a slight camber, meaning it was higher in the middle and sloped gently to the sides. This curvature ensured that rainwater would run off the surface into the drainage ditches that were dug along both sides of the road. This multi-layered construction, from the deep foundation to the crown surface, made Roman roads incredibly durable. So much so that many of their foundations, and in some cases even their original surfaces, are still in use today. To complete the road, milestones or miliaria were erected at every Roman mile, which was equivalent to 1,000 paces, or about 1,480 meters. These were cylindrical stone columns, several meters high, inscribed with the distance to the next major town, and often the name of the emperor or magistrate who had built or repaired that section of the road. They were the ancient equivalent of modern highway signs, allowing travelers and military commanders to know their precise location and the distance to their destination. The entire road was often built on a raised embankment, called an agger, to ensure it was well drained and clear of surrounding vegetation. The Romans built over 80,000 kilometers of these high-quality roads, connecting Britain to Mesopotamia, the Rhine to the Nile, creating a network that unified a vast and diverse empire for centuries.
If the roads were the arteries of the Roman Empire, the aqueducts were its veins, delivering the lifeblood of water to its burgeoning urban centers. The city of Rome, which grew to a population of over 1 million people, could not have existed without the vast quantities of fresh water supplied by its 11 major aqueducts. This water was not primarily for drinking, though it served that purpose. The immense supply was a civic necessity, required for the great public baths, or thermae, which were central to Roman social life. For the hundreds of public fountains that provided water to the masses, for flushing the sewers, and for powering industrial processes like milling, construction of an aqueduct was a monumental undertaking, a statement of wealth, power, and engineering prowess that often took decades and immense capital investment to complete. They are perhaps more than any other structure, a symbol of the Roman mastery of applied physics and large-scale project management. The core principle of a Roman aqueduct was simple: gravity. The entire system, from the source to the city, was designed as a long, continuous, gently sloping channel. This required incredibly precise surveying. Roman engineers had to find a suitable water source, a spring or river at a high enough elevation to provide the necessary fall over many kilometers. The ideal gradient was slight, enough to keep the water moving at a steady pace without stagnating, but not so steep as to create a torrent that would erode the channel. The engineer and writer Vitruvius, in his work De Architectura, recommended a minimum gradient of 1 in 4,800, though in practice, gradients varied significantly depending on the terrain. A typical gradient was around 1 in 3,000, a drop of about 34 centimeters for every kilometer of length. Maintaining such a shallow, consistent slope over a distance that could exceed 90 kilometers, as in the case of the Aqua Marcia, was an extraordinary feat of surveying. Engineers used instruments like the chorobates, the long leveling table, and the more complex dioptra, a precursor to the theodolite, to plot the course and maintain the precise gradient. Contrary to popular imagination, which pictures Roman aqueducts as endless lines of towering arches, the vast majority of an aqueduct's length was hidden from view. For most of their course, they were simple subterranean channels, about 1 meter wide and 2 meters high, just large enough for a worker to enter for maintenance. These channels, or speakers, were dug into the ground and lined with masonry. This method had several advantages. It protected the water from contamination, kept it cool, and was far more economical than building above ground. Tunnels were cut directly through hills to maintain the gradient and avoid long detours. These were dug using a system of vertical shafts, which provided ventilation and a means to remove spoil. It was only when the aqueduct had to cross a valley or a depression that the iconic monumental arcades were necessary. These bridges were built to maintain the height and gradient of the water channel across the low ground. Their construction was a testament to the Roman perfection of the arch. A simple post-stand lintel system, like that used by the Greeks, could not span wide gaps without massive, closely spaced columns. The Roman arch, however, could span much greater distances. It worked by transferring the vertical force of the weight above it into compressive stress, which was channeled outwards and down through the piers. The key element was the central voussoir, the keystone, which locked all the other stones in place. By building a series of arches side by side, they could create a strong, stable, relatively lightweight structure using repeating standardized units. For very deep valleys, they would build tiers of arches, one on top of the other, as seen in the magnificent Pont du Gard in southern France. In some cases, where building a bridge was impractical, Roman engineers used an alternative method, the inverted siphon. This was a sophisticated application of the principle that water finds its own level. The aqueduct channel would feed into a header tank on one side of a valley. From this tank, a series of large, strong pipes, usually made of lead and reinforced with stone blocks, would carry the water down the slope, across the valley floor on a low venter bridge, and up the other side to a receiving tank at a slightly lower elevation than the header tank. The pressure at the bottom of the siphon could be immense, and the engineering challenge of creating pipes and joints that could withstand it was significant. While more expensive and difficult to maintain than arcades, siphons were a crucial tool in the Roman engineers' repertoire. The water channel itself was meticulously constructed. It was typically lined with a waterproof cement called opus signinum, a mixture of mortar and crushed terracotta tiles. This reddish, concrete-like material prevented leaks and kept the water pure. Access points were built into the channel for maintenance, and settling tanks were constructed along the route to allow sediment and impurities to sink to the bottom. Once the aqueduct reached the city walls, it terminated at a large distribution basin called a castellum aquae. From here, the water was channeled into a complex network of smaller pipes, usually made of lead, which fed the various public fountains, baths, and for a fee, the private villas of the wealthy. This entire system, from the distant mountain spring to the urban fountain, was a marvel of hydraulic engineering, a public work on a scale that would not be seen again for more than 1,000 years. The 2nd century BC was a period of profound transformation for the Roman Republic. The immense wealth and territory gained from the Punic Wars and the conquest of the Hellenistic East flowed back to Rome. But it did not flow evenly. This new wealth exacerbated underlying social and economic tensions that had been developing for generations. The traditional backbone of the Roman army and state, the small-scale citizen farmer, was slowly being displaced, leading to a crisis that threatened the very fabric of the Republic. This crisis was not one of dramatic battles, but of slow, grinding economic change, of land ownership, debt, and the food supply. The attempts to address these issues, led by the brothers Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, were not merely political power plays. They were complex legislative efforts to solve deep-seated, structural problems through the redistribution of public land and the regulation of the grain market. The central issue was the ager publicus, the public land owned by the Roman state. This was land that had been acquired through conquest over the centuries. In theory, this land was to be leased out in small parcels to Roman citizens. In practice, however, vast tracts of this public land had been gradually and often illegally occupied by wealthy landowners. They consolidated these holdings into enormous estates called latifundia. These estates were no longer worked by citizen farmers, but by large gangs of slaves, a resource made plentiful and cheap by Rome's recent wars. The small farmer, by contrast, was caught in a difficult cycle. He was required to serve in the legions for long campaigns, often years at a time, in distant lands like Spain or Greece. During his absence, his small farm would often fall into neglect or debt. Unable to compete with the cheap grain produced by the slave-run latifundia, he would often be forced to sell his land frequently to his wealthy neighbor and migrate to the city of Rome, joining a growing landless and unemployed urban proletariat. This process had two critical consequences. It concentrated land and wealth in the hands of a few, and it eroded the recruitment base for the Roman army, as property ownership was still a prerequisite for military service. Into this slowly building crisis stepped Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus. A nobleman who was elected tribune of the plebs in 133 BC, he sought to address the land problem directly with a single sweeping piece of legislation, the Lex Sempronia Agraria. The law was, in its essence, a reassertion of a much older, unenforced law that limited the amount of public land any single individual could hold to 500 iugera, roughly 320 acres. Tiberius's proposal was to enforce this limit. Any ager publicus held in excess of this amount would be reclaimed by the state. In return, the current occupier would be granted title to the 500 iugera they were allowed to keep, effectively turning their lease into private ownership. The reclaimed land would then be redistributed by a three-man commission, a triumvirate, into small plots of around 30 iugera, or 20 acres. These plots would be given to landless Roman citizens, who would hold them as permanent tenants and pay a small rent to the state. The goal was twofold: to restore the class of small farmers, who were the foundation of the army, and to alleviate poverty and overcrowding in Rome. The legislative process itself was complex and contentious. Tiberius bypassed the Senate, which was largely composed of the wealthy landowners who stood to lose from his reform, and took his bill directly to the plebeian council. When another tribune, Marcus Octavius, vetoed the bill at the behest of the Senate, Tiberius took the unprecedented step of having the council vote to depose him, arguing that a tribune who acted against the interests of the people had forfeited his office. The law was then passed, and the Land Commission, consisting of Tiberius, his younger brother Gaius, and his father-in-law, was established. The implementation, however, was a slow and difficult administrative task. It required a massive survey of public land throughout Italy, a process of determining which lands were public and which were private, and adjudicating countless disputes. This was a bureaucratic challenge of immense scale. 10 years later, in 123 BC, Gaius Gracchus was elected tribune and launched an even broader and more complex legislative program. He not only revived his brother's land commission, but also tackled the problem of the urban poor through another major administrative reform: the Lex Frumentaria, grain law. This law established that the state would purchase large quantities of grain from overseas, primarily from Sicily and Sardinia, transport it to Rome, store it in state-built granaries, and then sell it to Roman citizens at a fixed, subsidized price below the market rate. This was not a free handout, but a price control mechanism designed to protect the urban population from the wild fluctuations and speculative pricing of the private grain market. The implementation of this policy required a significant new layer of state bureaucracy. It involved negotiating large-scale supply contracts, managing a fleet of transport ships, overseeing the construction and maintenance of warehouses, and organizing a system of distribution. It was a massive logistical undertaking that made the state, for the first time, directly responsible for the food security of its capital city, establishing the principle of the cura unknown, the care of the grain supply, which would remain a central feature of Roman administration for centuries.
The socio-economic pressures that the Gracchi brothers had attempted to solve through legislation eventually found a different, more transformative solution in the military sphere. By the late 2nd century BC, the traditional Roman military system was in crisis. The Jugurthine War in North Africa and the looming threat of migrating Germanic tribes, the Cimbri and Teutones in the north, exposed severe manpower shortages and inefficiencies in the old legionary structure. The Republic needed a larger, more permanent, and more professional army than the traditional levy of property-owning citizens could provide. The series of organizational and logistical changes that addressed this need are collectively known as the Marian Reforms, attributed to the general and statesman Gaius Marius, who was elected consul for the first time in 107 BC. These reforms were not a single legislative act, but a pragmatic evolution that fundamentally altered the composition, structure, and loyalty of the Roman army, setting the stage for the final century of the Republic. The cornerstone of the Marian reforms was the abolition of the property requirement for military service. Traditionally, the Roman army was a citizen militia composed of the assiduous citizens who owned enough property to be able to afford their own equipment. As we have seen, this class of small farmers had been steadily shrinking, making it increasingly difficult for consuls to raise legions. Faced with the need for more soldiers for the war against Jugurtha, Marius took the radical and momentous step of opening recruitment to the caput censi, or the head count, the lowest class of Roman citizens, who owned no property and were counted only by their person in the census. This single change transformed the Roman army from a temporary civic obligation into a viable long-term career for the poor and unemployed. For a landless citizen, the army now offered steady pay, the promise of food and shelter, and the potential for loot and a bonus upon discharge. The state, in turn, gained access to a vast new pool of recruits. This change in recruitment necessitated a corresponding change in logistics and equipment, since the new recruits could not afford their own arms and armor. The state took over the responsibility of providing standardized equipment for all legionaries. This led to a greater uniformity in the appearance and fighting capability of the Roman soldier. The standard kit of a Marian legionary consisted of several key items. For protection, he wore a simple bronze or iron helmet, often of the Montefertino type, and a coat of chainmail, the larica hamon. He carried a large, curved, rectangular shield, the scutum, made of layers of wood glued together, covered in canvas and leather, and edged with iron. His primary weapon was the gladius hispaniensis, a short, double-edged, stabbing sword, ideal for close-quarters combat. His most distinctive weapon, however, was the pilum, a heavy javelin. The Marianera pilum was ingeniously designed with a soft iron shank behind its hardened tip. When it struck an enemy's shield, the shank would bend, making the javelin impossible to pull out and throw back. The weight of the embedded pilum would also encumber the shield, forcing the enemy to discard it and face the Roman advance unprotected. Marius also made significant changes to the army's logistical train to increase mobility and reduce the size of the slow-moving baggage train that traditionally followed the army. He required each soldier to carry a significant portion of his own equipment and supplies. This included his armor and weapons, as well as entrenching tools, a cooking pot, several days' worth of grain, and 2 wooden stakes for constructing the marching camp's palisade. This heavy load, which could weigh over 40 kilograms, earned the soldiers the nickname Muli Mariani, or Marius's mules. While burdensome for the individual soldier, this system made the legions faster, more self-sufficient, and capable of operating for longer periods without relying on a fixed supply line. The internal structure of the legion was also reorganized for greater tactical flexibility and cohesion. The maniple, a unit of 120 men, which had been the primary tactical unit of the plebeian legion, was replaced by the cohort as the legion's main building block. A legion was now composed of 10 cohorts. Each cohort contained approximately 480 men, divided into 6 centuries of 80 men each, commanded by a centurion. This new structure was simpler and more robust. A cohort was large enough to function as a small, independent tactical unit capable of undertaking detached assignments. In a major battle, the 10 cohorts of a legion could be deployed in various formations, offering the commander greater flexibility than the older, more rigid 3-line system of maniples. To further foster unit identity and loyalty, Marius is credited with assigning a single standard to each legion, the silver eagle or aquila, mounted on a pole. The loss of the legion's eagle was the ultimate disgrace, and its defense was the legion's sacred duty. This created a powerful, almost religious bond between the soldiers and their specific legion. The most profound and far-reaching consequence of these reforms, however, was the shift in the soldiers' loyalty. The new professional legionaries were landless men who served for long terms, often 16 to 20 years. They had no farms to return to. Their livelihood, their future, and their retirement depended entirely on their commanding general. It became an accepted practice for a successful general to secure a grant of land from the Senate for his retiring veterans. This meant that the soldier's primary allegiance was no longer to the abstract entity of the Senate and people of Rome, but to the individual commander who led them to victory and provided for their future. This created powerful private armies, loyal to men like Marius, Sulla, Pompey, and Caesar, rather than to the state. The Marian reforms, born of pragmatic military necessity, solved Rome's manpower crisis, but in doing so, created the very instrument that would ultimately be used to dismantle the Republic. After decades of brutal civil war that saw the collapse of the republican system, the victory of Octavian, later known as Augustus, at the Battle of Actium in 31 BC, ushered in a new era. This period, known as the Pax Romana or Roman peace, is often celebrated as a golden age of stability and prosperity. However, for our purposes, it is more useful to view it not as an era of glory, but as a period of profound and methodical administrative reorganization. Augustus was not a king. He was a master bureaucrat. His great achievement was the creation of a new, stable, and remarkably durable political and administrative framework known as the Principate. He carefully maintained the outward forms of the old republic. The Senate still met, consuls were still elected, while systematically concentrating all real power in his own hands. This new system was built on the slow, patient work of administration, conducting a census, reforming taxation, reorganizing the provinces, and professionalizing the government. The foundation of the Augustan administrative system was a comprehensive understanding of the empire's resources. To this end, Augustus initiated a massive, empire-wide census. This was not merely a head count. It was a detailed registration of citizens and their property, a colossal undertaking that took years to complete. Provincial governors were tasked with compiling detailed records of population, land ownership, and agricultural assets in their territories. This data was essential for the fair and efficient assessment of taxes, which were the financial bedrock of the new regime. The census replaced the chaotic and often corrupt system of republican tax farming with a more regularized and predictable system of direct taxation. The two main taxes were the tributum soli, a tax on land and property, and the tributum capitis, a poll tax on individuals. While the collection was still sometimes contracted out, the rates were now based on the detailed census data, making the system less arbitrary and exploitative than it had been under the late Republic. This new revenue stream funded the three main pillars of the Augustan state: the army, the bureaucracy, and a massive program of public works. Augustus formally established a permanent, professional standing army. He set the number of legions at 28, stationing them strategically along the empire's vast frontiers, from the Rhine and Danube in the north to the Euphrates in the east. He established a fixed term of service 20 years for a legionary and, crucially, created a state-funded military treasury, the aerarium militare, to provide retirement benefits for his veterans. This treasury was funded by new inheritance and sales taxes. This reform was a critical administrative step. It institutionalized the provision for retired soldiers, breaking the bond of personal dependency between soldiers and their generals that had been so destructive to the Republic. The army was now a permanent institution of the state, loyal to the emperor who paid them and guaranteed their pension. To manage the now vast and complex empire, Augustus created a new civil service, a nascent bureaucracy that was far more efficient than the ad hoc system of the Republic. He drew his administrators not only from the traditional senatorial elite, but also from the equestrian order, the wealthy business class, and even from among his own trusted freedmen. These men were appointed to new administrative posts, or prefectures, that oversaw critical functions. The Praetorian prefect commanded the emperor's personal guard. The Praetorian Guard, but also became a key judicial and administrative official. The prefect of the city was responsible for maintaining order in Rome. The prefect of the vigils commanded a new corps of firefighters and night watchmen. And, perhaps most importantly, the prefect of the grain supply, the prefectus, unknown, managed the entire logistical chain of the state's subsidized grain dole, ensuring the capital's population remained fed and quiescent. The administration of the provinces was also systematically reorganized. Augustus divided the provinces into two categories. The older, more peaceful and secure provinces remained under the nominal control of the Senate. Their governors, called proconsuls, were chosen by lot from among the senators. The crucial frontier provinces, however, those with a heavy military presence, like Gaul, Syria, and Egypt, were designated as imperial provinces. Augustus governed these directly through his own appointed legates, or legati, Augusti, pro praetor. These were men of senatorial or equestrian rank who served as his personal representatives, commanding the legions and managing the provincial administration. This division was a political masterstroke. It gave the Senate the illusion of shared power, while ensuring that the emperor retained direct control over the vast majority of the Roman army. This system, with its professional army, its burgeoning civil service, and its rationalized system of taxation and provincial government, created a framework of stability that lasted for over 2 centuries. The Pax Romana was not an absence of conflict. There were still wars on the frontiers, but rather the imposition of a vast, orderly, and enduring administrative system upon the Mediterranean world. The great machine of the Roman Empire, particularly after the Augustan reforms, was not run by emperors and senators alone. It was kept in motion by a growing class of administrators, clerks, and officials of bureaucracy that, while small by modern standards, was unprecedented in the ancient world. To understand the empire is to understand the quiet, methodical work of these men. Let us imagine the daily routine of a hypothetical mid-level administrator, a man named Gaius Valerius Macer, an equestrian who, through talent and connections, has secured a position as a procurator in the department of the fiscus, the imperial treasury, during the reign of the Emperor Vespasian. His day begins before dawn in his modest apartment, or insula. On the Querinal Hill, there is no dramatic call to arms, only the mundane ritual of dressing in his clean toga, the formal attire required for his public role. After a light breakfast of bread dipped in wine, his first duty is the salutatio, the morning reception. A few clients, a merchant seeking a letter of introduction, a young man from his hometown hoping for a minor clerical post-gather in his small reception area. He dispenses advice, accepts their respects, and reinforces the network of patronage that is essential to any Roman career. This is not a grand affair, but a small-scale, daily maintenance of social and political capital. By the third hour, he is walking through the bustling streets of Rome towards his office, located in a basilica near the Roman Forum. His workplace is not a private chamber, but a large, noisy hall filled with other officials. His desk is a simple wooden table, upon which are laid out the tools of his trade. There are no computers, no typewriters. There are stacks of papyrus scrolls, the empire's paper. There are wooden wax tablets, or tabulae, for taking temporary notes with a pointed stylus. For calculations, he uses a portable abacus, its beads clicking softly as he tallies figures. His work is the lifeblood of the empire. Information, specifically tax information. Today, a shipment of documents has arrived from the province of Bithynia Pontus. They are the annual tax returns sent by the provincial governor. Gaius's task is to review them. He unrolls a long papyrus scroll, its columns of neat cursive script detailing the revenue from the tributum soli, the land tax. His job is one of meticulous, mind-numbing verification. He must cross-reference the stated revenue with the census figures for that province, which are stored in the state archives, the tabularium, a massive building on the Capitoline Hill. He must check the governor's stated expenses, the cost of road repairs, the maintenance of public buildings, against established norms. He uses his abacus to check the arithmetic, ensuring the sums are correct. He notes a discrepancy. The revenue from a particular city seems lower than in the previous year. This is not a cause for alarm, but for process. He takes a wax tablet and, with his stylus, begins to draft a query. The language of his draft is precise, formal, and filled with the correct honorifics. He does not accuse the governor of anything. He simply requests clarification. To the most distinguished governor, Lucius Antonius Naso, he might begin. Greetings. In reviewing the accounts for the city of Nicaea, we note a variance in the land tax receipts compared to the preceding year. We would be grateful for any information you could provide regarding local conditions, such as harvest yields or changes in land use that might account for this variance. May you continue to prosper. This draft will be given to a scribe, a skilled slave or freedman who will copy it in perfect script onto a fresh sheet of papyrus. The final document will be checked by Gaius, then stamped with the seal of his department, and sent on its long journey back to Bithynia. A response might not be received for months. The pace of administration is slow, dictated by the speed of ships and horses. His afternoon is spent on other, similarly mundane tasks. He reviews a petition from a group of merchants in Ephesus who are complaining about the harbor fees. This requires him to consult the legal framework for that province, a collection of edicts and precedents stored in another set of scrolls. He dictates a summary of the case for his superior, a senior equestrian official, outlining the legal standing of the petition and offering a recommendation. He audits the accounts for a state-owned quarry in Egypt, checking the production figures against the wages paid to the workers and the cost of supplies. Every transaction, every petition, every report generates more papyrus. The bureaucracy runs on a river of ink. The work is repetitive, detailed, and utterly without glamour. There are no great speeches, no dramatic decisions. There is only the slow, steady process of checking, verifying, recording, and corresponding. It is the careful, methodical work of men like Gaius Valerius Macer, repeated in hundreds of offices across the empire, that allows the grand imperial system to function, to collect its revenue, to pay its soldiers, and to endure. His day ends not with a flourish, but with the simple act of rolling up his scrolls, tidying his desk, and walking home as the sun sets over the 7 hills. One of the most insidious and slow-moving crises to affect the Roman Empire was not caused by invading armies or political intrigue, but by a quiet technical process that took place in the imperial mints, the debasement of currency. For centuries, the Roman economy was underpinned by a relatively stable silver coinage, primarily the denarius. The value of this coin was based on its intrinsic metallic content. A denarius was worth what it was because it contained a known and trusted amount of pure silver. However, as the empire's expenses grew, particularly the immense cost of maintaining its professional army and as sources of new precious metals began to dwindle, emperors found themselves facing a persistent shortage of funds. Unable or unwilling to raise taxes sufficiently, they resorted to a seemingly simple solution. They began to reduce the amount of silver in each coin, mixing it with cheaper base metals like copper. This process, known as debasement, was a form of invisible taxation, and, over the long term, it created a slow-motion economic crisis that eroded public confidence and fueled rampant inflation. The process began in a very subtle way. The first significant debasement is attributed to the Emperor Nero in the year 64 AD. Prior to this, the denarius of the early empire was a coin of high purity, typically containing over 95% silver. Nero's reform was, by later standards, modest. He reduced the silver content of the denarius by about 10% to roughly 85%, and also slightly reduced its weight. From the state's perspective, this was a logical fiscal maneuver. If you have a certain amount of silver, and you reduce the silver content of each coin by 10%, you can produce approximately 10% more coins from the same amount of precious metal. This allows the state to meet its obligations, paying the soldiers, funding construction projects without having to acquire new bullion. To the casual user, the Neronian denarius looked and felt almost identical to its predecessors. The change was not immediately obvious. However, this set a dangerous precedent. Subsequent emperors, especially when faced with their own financial pressures, followed and accelerated the trend. The process was gradual, a slow decline over more than a century. Under the Flavian dynasty, the silver content remained relatively high. Trajan even temporarily improved the purity. But under Marcus Aurelius, facing the strain of wars on the Danube frontier, the silver content dropped to around 75%. This is where the metallurgical process becomes important. To maintain the appearance of a silver coin, the mints developed techniques to treat the debased metal blanks, or flânez. One such technique was likely a process of acid leaching or heating, which would draw a thin layer of pure silver to the surface of the coin. When newly minted, the coin would appear to be made of pure silver, but as it circulated and wore down, the reddish copper core would begin to show through. The real acceleration of this process occurred during the crisis of the 3rd century, a period of intense civil war, foreign invasion, and political instability. Emperors rose and fell with alarming frequency, each needing to pay the armies that kept them in power. The need for coinage became desperate. By the reign of Septimius Severus, around the year 200 AD, the denarius contained only about 50% silver. Just a few decades later, the situation had become catastrophic. A new coin, the Antoninianess, was introduced by Agricola. It was valued at 2 denarii, but contained only about 1.5 times the silver, another subtle form of debasement. By the 260s, the Antoninianess, which had become the main silver coin, was a monetary fiction. It was essentially a bronze coin with a microscopic silver coating, containing perhaps only 2% to 5% silver. The economic consequences of this centuries-long process were profound. As the public became aware that the coins were no longer intrinsically valuable, they began to lose faith in the currency. This manifested in several ways. One was the application of Gresham's law, the principle that bad money drives out good. People would hoard the older, high-purity silver coins and spend the new, debased ones. This effectively removed the good currency from circulation, leaving only the low-value coins to be used in transactions. The result was inflation. Since the coins themselves had little intrinsic worth, merchants and producers demanded more of them for their goods and services. A loaf of bread that once cost a few sesterces a bronze denomination might now cost several debased Antoniniani. Prices for everyday goods spiraled upwards. Soldiers, who were paid in these increasingly worthless coins, demanded higher and higher wages, which in turn forced the state to mint even more debased currency to pay them, creating a vicious inflationary cycle. The state itself began to refuse to accept its own currency for tax payments, instead demanding payment in kind, that is, in goods like grain or oil, in gold. This slow, technical, and administrative process of debasement, born of fiscal necessity, ultimately dismantled the monetary foundation of the Roman economy, contributing significantly to the instability and eventual transformation of the empire. By the time Diocletian, a Dalmatian officer of humble birth, ascended to the imperial throne in 284 AD, the Roman Empire was in a state of near-terminal crisis. The preceding 5 decades had been a chaotic blur of civil war, foreign invasion, plague, and economic collapse, fueled by the hyperinflation we have just discussed. The empire was too large to be managed by a single emperor from a single capital. Its frontiers were under constant pressure, and its administrative and fiscal systems were broken. Diocletian was a conservative revolutionary, a man who sought to save the Roman system by fundamentally and autocratically restructuring it. His reign was not one of conquest, but of intense, top-down administrative reform. He sought to solve the empire's systemic problems through the methodical application of bureaucracy, creating a more rigid, more centralized, and more authoritarian state. The most famous of his reforms was the creation of the tetrarchy, or rule of four, recognizing that a single emperor could no longer effectively defend and administer the entire empire. Diocletian devised a system of collegiate rule. In 285 AD, he appointed a trusted military colleague, Maximian, as his co-emperor. Diocletian took the title of Augustus of the East, while Maximian became Augustus of the West. Then, in 293 AD, he expanded the system. Each Augustus adopted a junior emperor, or Caesar, who would be his designated successor. Diocletian chose Galerius as his Caesar in the east, and Maximian chose Constantius in the west. This was not a division of the empire, but a division of administrative and military labor. The empire remained legally one, but it was now governed from 4 different capitals, each located closer to the volatile frontiers. Nicomedia in the east for Diocletian, Milan in the west for Maximian, Sirmium on the Danube for Galerius, and Trier on the Rhine for Constantius. The system was designed to provide for an orderly succession. The Caesars would become Augusti upon the retirement of their seniors, and to ensure that an emperor was always near any potential trouble spot. To support this new imperial structure, Diocletian enacted a sweeping reorganization of the provincial administration. The old, large provinces were systematically broken down into smaller, more manageable units. The number of provinces was more than doubled, from around 50 to over 100. These smaller provinces were then grouped together into 12 new administrative units called dioceses, each governed by an official known as a vicarus, who acted as the deputy of the praetorian prefect. This created additional layers of bureaucracy, but it also reduced the power of any single provincial governor, making it harder for them to launch a rebellion. Furthermore, Diocletian completed the separation of military and civil authority. A provincial governor was now a purely civilian judge and administrator. The troops stationed in his province were commanded by a separate military officer, the dux. This division of power was another safeguard against usurpation. The most complex and ambitious of Diocletian's reforms was his attempt to overhaul the imperial tax system. With the currency all but worthless, the state had increasingly resorted to arbitrary requisitions of goods, the unknown emilitres, to supply the army. Diocletian sought to regularize this system. He introduced a new method of assessment, known as the capitatio eugatio. This was a highly detailed system that attempted to create a uniform basis for taxation across the empire. The eugatio part of the system assessed the value of land, not just by its size, but by its quality and type of cultivation. A eugum, or unit of land, was not a fixed area. It was a conceptual unit of productive value. For example, a certain number of acres of prime vineyard in Italy might be assessed as 1 ugum, while the same number of acres of poor pasture land in Egypt might be assessed as only a fraction of a ugum. The capitatio part of the system assessed the labor available to work the land, counting the number of people, and in some cases, animals. Every year, the state would calculate its budgetary needs, how much grain, wine, oil, and other supplies the army and the bureaucracy required. This total amount, the indictio, was then divided by the total number of taxable units in the empire to determine the tax rate for that year. The system was designed to be predictable and uniform. allowing the state to budget effectively and extract the resources it needed directly, bypassing the collapsed monetary economy. It was a massive, data-driven bureaucratic exercise, requiring a constant, rolling census to keep the tax rolls up to date. It was also a rigid system that tended to tie agricultural workers to their land, a significant step towards the serfdom of the later Middle Ages. Finally, in an attempt to combat the runaway inflation that continued to plague the economy, Diocletian issued his famous edict on maximum prices in 301 AD. This decree, fragments of which have been found across the Eastern Empire, set a fixed maximum price for over 1,000 goods and services. It listed everything from wheat, barley, and wine, two different qualities of textiles, from the cost of shipping to the daily wages for laborers, scribes, and teachers. The penalty for selling a good above its legal price was death. The edict was a spectacular failure. The prices were often set below the actual cost of production and transport, leading merchants to pull their goods from the market rather than sell them at a loss. This created widespread shortages and fueled a thriving black market. The edict was ultimately unenforceable and was quietly abandoned. It stands as a monument to Diocletian's administrative ambition and his belief that the empire's deep-seated problems could be solved through the application of absolute, centralized authority. The eventual split of the Roman Empire into distinct Eastern and Western political entities was not a sudden event, but the culmination of a long and gradual process of divergence. It was a practical administrative solution to the immense challenge of governing a territory that stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia. The division was rooted in pre-existing cultural and economic realities and was formalized through a series of administrative decisions, most notably Diocletian's Tetrarchy and the founding of Constantinople. This process was not seen at the time as a dramatic schism, but as a logical evolution in the management of the Roman state, a slow drifting apart of two halves that were becoming increasingly distinct in their character and fortunes. The underlying fault line had existed for centuries. The eastern half of the empire, encompassing Greece, Anatolia, Syria, and Egypt, was the older, wealthier, and more urbanized region. It was the world of the Hellenistic kingdoms conquered by Rome. Its common language of commerce, administration, and high culture was Greek. Its cities were larger and more numerous, its trade networks more extensive, and its economy more dynamic. The western half, which included Italy, Gaul, Spain, Britain, and North Africa, was, with the exception of Italy itself, a more recently conquered and less developed region. Its common language was Latin, while it possessed great agricultural wealth and mineral resources. It was generally more rural and less economically vibrant than the East. For centuries, these two halves were held together by a unified political and military structure, but the cultural and linguistic differences were always present. Diocletian's Tetrarchy, while intended to unify the empire's administration, paradoxically accelerated the process of division. By establishing separate imperial courts and capitals in the East and West, each with its own Augustus and Caesar, it created distinct spheres of political and military authority. An administrator or soldier in the West would look to the court at Milan or Trier for promotion and policy, while his counterpart in the East would look to Nicomedia or Cirene. This created separate administrative hierarchies and career paths. Although the empire was still one in theory, in practice it was being governed as two separate entities. The civil wars that followed Diocletian's retirement saw the collapse of the tetrarchic system, but not the principle of divided rule. The next crucial step was taken by Constantine the Great. After reuniting the empire under his sole rule, Constantine made a decision of immense strategic and symbolic importance. In 330 AD, he formally dedicated a new capital, Constantinople, on the site of the ancient Greek city of Byzantium. This new Rome, strategically located on the defensible peninsula of the Bosphorus, straddling the trade routes between Europe and Asia, was consciously built to be the equal of the old Rome. It was given its own senate, its own urban prefect, and its own subsidized grain supply. The founding of Constantinople created a new political, administrative, and economic center of gravity in the East. While Rome remained a city of immense prestige and the seat of the most powerful Western senators, it was no longer the sole center of the Roman world. The imperial court, the central bureaucracy, and the emperor's presence were now more often in the East, which was also the more defensible and economically vital half of the empire. For the remainder of the 4th century, the empire was sometimes ruled by a single emperor, but more often by 2 conquerors, one residing in the east and one in the west. This became standard administrative practice. The final, formal, and permanent administrative division occurred after the death of the Emperor Theodosius I in 395 AD in his will. Theodosius bequeathed the empire to his 2 young sons. His elder son, Arcadius, became the emperor of the East, ruling from Constantinople. His younger son, Honorius, became the emperor of the West, eventually ruling from Ravenna. After this point, the 2 halves of the empire were never again politically reunited. They remained, in theory, 2 parts of a single Roman empire, and the laws passed by one emperor were often accepted by the other. But in practice, they were now separate states with their own courts, their own armies, their own bureaucracies, and, increasingly, their own separate destinies. The division was a practical recognition of a reality that had been developing for centuries. The 2 halves of the Mediterranean world, once united by Roman military power, were now on divergent administrative and historical paths. The term barbarian invasions, often used to describe the end of the Western Roman Empire, conjures images of savage hordes suddenly appearing at the frontiers to burn and pillage. While there were certainly moments of intense violence and destruction, this picture is a dramatic oversimplification. It is more accurate and, for our purposes, more methodically calming. To view the events of the 4th and 5th centuries AD not as a simple invasion, but as a long, complex, and multifaceted process of demographic change. It was a period of large-scale human migration, driven by a variety of factors, in which the relationship between the Roman state and the peoples living along its borders underwent a fundamental transformation. The process was one of accommodation, negotiation, and assimilation as much as it was one of conflict. The Roman state, facing manpower shortages, increasingly turned to these barbarian groups, not as enemies, but as a source of soldiers and farmers, a policy that slowly altered the very identity of the Roman army and the provinces it was meant to defend. The peoples the Romans called barbarians, a catch-all term for anyone living outside the empire's borders who did not speak Latin or Greek, were not a monolithic entity. They were a diverse collection of tribal confederations, such as the Goths, Vandals, Franks, and Alemanni, each with their own distinct language, social structure, and relationship with the empire. For centuries, the Roman frontier particularly along the Rhine and Danube rivers, was not an impermeable wall, but a porous membrane. There was constant interaction. Trade flowed back and forth. Roman cultural influences spread into the barbarian world, and barbarians were regularly recruited, either individually or in small groups, to serve as auxiliary troops in the Roman army. This was a long-standing and stable system of interaction. This dynamic began to change in the late 4th century, primarily due to pressure from the Huns, a nomadic people from the Central Asian steppes, who moved westwards, displacing the peoples in their path. In the 370s AD, the Huns shattered the power of the Goths, living north of the Danube, fleeing the Huns. A large group of Goths, the Tervingi, led by their chieftain, Fritigorn, appeared on the Danube frontier in 376 AD and petitioned the Eastern Roman Emperor, Valens, for permission to cross into the empire and settle as refugees. This was not an unprecedented request. The Romans had a long history of settling foreign peoples within their borders. However, the sheer number of Gothic refugees, tens of thousands of men, women, and children, presented an immense logistical challenge. The Roman administration on the Danube, led by corrupt and incompetent officials, completely mismanaged the situation. They failed to provide the promised food supplies, exploiting the desperate Goths and even, according to some sources, forcing them to sell their own children into slavery in exchange for dog meat. This mistreatment led to a desperate Gothic uprising. The subsequent conflict culminated in the Battle of Adrianople in 378 AD, a catastrophic defeat for the Romans, in which Emperor Valens himself was killed. This battle was a turning point. It demonstrated that a large, cohesive barbarian army operating inside the empire could defeat a major Roman field army. In the aftermath, Emperor Theodosius I pursued a new policy. Unable to expel the Goths, he negotiated a formal treaty, or feudus, with them in 382 AD. Under the terms of this treaty, the Goths were settled on Roman land in the Balkans as a semi-autonomous, allied people. They were known as foederati. They were allowed to live under their own laws and rulers, but were obligated to provide military service to the Roman army, fighting not as regular Roman soldiers, but as allied contingents under the command of their own chieftains. This treaty established a new model for incorporating barbarian groups into the empire. It was a pragmatic solution to a difficult problem, but it created, for the first time, a state within a state, a large, unified, and armed non-Roman population living permanently within Roman borders. This model would be repeated throughout the 5th century in the West. As central authority weakened, various groups crossed the frontiers. In the winter of 406 AD, the Rhine frontier, stripped of troops, froze over, allowing a massive confederation of Vandals, Alans, and Suabi to cross into Gaul, from which they were never expelled. The Visigoths, under their leader, Alaric, famously sacked the city of Rome in 410 AD, not to destroy the empire, but to pressure the emperor into granting them land and supplies. They were eventually settled as foederati in southwestern Gaul. The Vandals crossed from Spain into North Africa, capturing the vital province and its grain supply. The Franks and Burgundians established themselves in northern Gaul. Each of these movements was a complex process of migration, negotiation, and conflict. These groups were not trying to overthrow the Roman Empire, an institution they often admired and sought to join. They were seeking security, land, and a place within the Roman system. The result, however, was the gradual transfer of effective military and political control of the western provinces from the imperial bureaucracy to the leaders of these settled barbarian groups, a slow and complex demographic transformation that ultimately rendered the Western Roman Emperor irrelevant. The fall of Rome is often marked by a single date, 476 AD, the year the last Western Roman Emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by the Germanic chieftain Odoacer. But this event was not a sudden collapse. It was merely the quiet, almost unremarkable end to a long process of political and economic disintegration that had been unfolding for generations. The end of the Western Empire was not a dramatic explosion, but a slow, gradual fading, a withering away of central authority and the complex systems that supported it. This process can be understood by examining the slow decay of its infrastructure, the fragmentation of its economy, and the localization of power into the hands of a new Romano-Germanic aristocracy. The physical infrastructure of the Western Empire, its roads, bridges, and aqueducts, had been built and maintained by the power of a strong, centralized state with a vast tax base. As that state weakened, its ability to fund large-scale public works diminished. The intricate system of tax collection, already strained, began to break down completely in the 5th century as provinces like Britain, Gaul, Spain, and North Africa fell out of direct imperial control. With its revenue base collapsing, the Western imperial court, now based in the easily defensible marsh city of Ravenna, could no longer afford to maintain the vast network of roads that held the empire together. Repairs ceased. Without constant upkeep, the carefully engineered layers of the roads began to fail. Weeds grew through the paving stones, drainage ditches clogged, and bridges fell into disrepair. Travel became slower, more difficult, and more dangerous. The great arteries of the empire became clogged and eventually severed. This decay of the transport network had a profound effect on the economy. The integrated long-distance trade that had characterized the Pax Romana slowly ground to a halt. The specialized pottery produced in North African workshops, once shipped all across the Mediterranean, could no longer reach markets in Gaul or Italy. The mass-produced glass from the Rhineland workshops disappeared from archaeological sites in Britain. In place of this large-scale commercial economy, a more localized, fragmented economy emerged. Regions and even individual estates were forced to become more self-sufficient. The luxury villas of the Gallic aristocracy, which had once imported wine from Italy and olive oil from Spain, began to produce these goods for themselves on a smaller, less efficient scale. The world became smaller. The economic unity of the Western Mediterranean, which had been forged by Roman power, dissolved into a patchwork of localized, subsistence-level economies. This economic fragmentation was mirrored by a political one, as the central imperial government in Ravenna became increasingly impoverished and irrelevant. Real power shifted to the provinces, and specifically to the local magnates, the wealthy Roman senators, and the kings and chieftains of the settled foederati groups. In a province like Gaul, a local Gallo-Roman aristocrat, living in his fortified villa, now had more in common with his new Visigothic or Frankish neighbors than he did with the distant emperor. They were the new power in the land. They controlled the local military forces, they collected what taxes they could, and they administered justice. A new, hybrid ruling class began to emerge, blending the traditions of Roman land ownership and administration with the military culture of the Germanic leaders. The life of the average person became increasingly localized. A farmer in northern Gaul was no longer a citizen of a vast Mediterranean-spanning empire, but a tenant on the estate of a powerful local lord, be he Roman or Frankish. His world shrank to the boundaries of that estate. The great cities of the West also began to change. Without the tax revenue and the grain shipments managed by the imperial bureaucracy, they could no longer support large populations. The population of Rome itself, once over 1 million, shrank dramatically. The great public spaces, the forums, the baths, the temples fell into disuse and were gradually abandoned. People began to scavenge materials from these monumental structures to build more modest homes or defensive walls. The urban landscape began to reflect the new reality, a poorer, more dangerous, and more localized world. So, when the chieftain Odoacer deposed the boy emperor Romulus Augustulus in 476, it was not a world-shattering event. It was a final, quiet recognition of a state of affairs that had existed for decades. Odoacer did not declare himself emperor. Instead, he had the imperial insignia of the West packed up and sent to the Eastern Roman Emperor, Zeno, in Constantinople, with a message stating that one emperor was sufficient for the whole empire. He then proceeded to rule Italy as its king, under the nominal authority of the distant Eastern Emperor. The Western Roman Empire was not conquered. It simply ceased to be a functioning administrative entity. It had slowly and quietly dissolved, its authority and functions devolving to the local and regional powers that would eventually form the kingdoms of the early Middle Ages. The end of the Western Empire was not the end of Rome. The political entity centered on Ravenna may have dissolved, but the vast and complex system that Rome had built over a millennium did not simply vanish. It left behind deep and lasting echoes that continue to resonate today. This legacy is not found in the grand narrative of emperors and battles, but in the quiet, persistent influence of its most fundamental administrative and cultural structures, its language, its law, and its engineering. These were the systems that outlasted the state that created them, becoming the foundational material for the new civilizations that would emerge in Europe. The most immediate and pervasive legacy of Rome is its language. Latin, the administrative and military language of the Western Empire, did not die with the last emperor. It transformed. In the centuries following the collapse of central authority, the formal classical Latin of the bureaucracy and literature began to diverge into regional dialects. This process was slow, organic, and undocumented. In the former provinces of Italy, Gaul, and Spain, the common spoken form of the language, known as Vulgar Latin, gradually evolved, blending with the languages of the settled Germanic peoples. Over many generations, these dialects became distinct new languages: Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Romanian. These are the Romance languages, and their shared vocabulary and grammatical structures are a direct, living link to the Roman past. A vast number of words in non-Romance languages, including English, are also derived from Latin, a testament to its enduring role as the language of law, religion, and scholarship throughout the Middle Ages and beyond. The very alphabet we use to write these words is a direct descendant of the one used by the Roman bureaucrat to tally his accounts. Equally profound was the legacy of Roman law. The Roman legal system was one of its greatest intellectual achievements, a sophisticated and comprehensive framework for resolving disputes and regulating society. The culmination of this tradition was the Corpus Juris Civilis, the body of civil law, compiled in the 6th century under the direction of the Eastern Roman Emperor Justinian. This massive work codified centuries of Roman statutes, legal precedents, and the opinions of eminent jurists. While its direct influence in the West was limited immediately after the collapse, the principles of Roman law were preserved in the legal codes of the new Germanic kingdoms and, more importantly, within the institutional structure of the Catholic Church, whose canon law was heavily based on Roman legal procedure. In the later Middle Ages, beginning in the 11th century, the study of Roman law was revived in the new universities of Europe, starting in Bologna. The logical structure and detailed provisions of the Corpus Juris Civilis became the foundation for most of the modern civil law systems that are used across continental Europe, Latin America, and in many other parts of the world today. Concepts that we take for granted, such as the distinction between public and private law, the principles of contracts, and the idea of corporate personhood, have their roots in the methodical legal thinking of Roman jurists. Finally, there is the physical legacy of Roman engineering, the silent, crumbling ruins that still dot the European landscape. The aqueducts, their arches striding across valleys, are a quiet testament to a lost mastery of hydraulic engineering. The roads, though their surfaces are gone, often still define the path of modern highways, their straight, direct routes, a ghostly reminder of the legions for whom they were built. In cities like Rome, Enchiems, or Trier, the remains of basilicas, amphitheaters, and baths speak of a sophisticated urban culture and a command of construction techniques, particularly the use of concrete and the arch, that would not be equaled for centuries. But the legacy is not just in these monumental ruins. It is in the more mundane aspects of urban planning, the grid layout of cities, the concept of a central public square or forum, and the provision of public sanitation systems. These ruins are more than just tourist attractions. They are the physical remnants of a complex administrative system, a state that had the capacity to organize labor and resources on a massive scale to build for permanence. The slow decay of these structures mirrors the slow decay of the state that built them, but their very survival is an echo of the power and ambition of the Roman system. The empire, as a political unit, is gone, but its foundational code in language, law, and construction remains, embedded in the operating system of the Western world. Our long, slow journey through the centuries has come to an end. We have traced the rise of a small city-state, watched it build a republic on a foundation of intricate rules and procedures, and seen that republic transform into a vast bureaucratic empire. We have examined the slow, methodical processes of its administration, its engineering, its economy, and its eventual, gradual dissolution. The great machine of Rome has wound down. The voices of the consuls, the footsteps of the legions, and the scratching of the bureaucrats' stylus have all faded into the quiet of history. There is nothing more to learn tonight. There are no more details to remember. There is only the silence that follows a long story. Allow the quiet to deepen. Allow your mind to be still. Let the gentle weight of all that has passed guide you now into a deep and peaceful sleep. Rest well.